Well, very good morning to everybody. It's truly an honor and pleasure to be here in the beautiful city of Bucharest in a company of experts, and not to mention our very hardworking organizers, Middle East Political and Economic Institute and Euro Defense Romania. In this opening session, we will be discussing security strategies for MENA, and there are 5 subtopics that we will seek to explore. 1. Lessons from Afghanistan for the current crisis. Crisis, not crisis, because we have a few. Status of the current international security environment. 3. Evaluation of Iran-Saudi Arabia relations. 4. New ways and bridges in the region. And 5. Principles of collective security system. Now, we're very fortunate to have with us 6 highly distinguished panelists. They will each do a 5-minute presentation, and after each presentation, I'm happy to take questions from the floor before moving on to the next panelist. If there's any time left after everyone has done their presentation, I'm open to more questions from the floor as well. I'm going to sit on the answer. I'm going to be somewhat strict on the time because we're running behind time, but we'll try to be as flexible as possible. But forgive me if I have to cut you off at any one time. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our highly distinguished panelists. And forgive me if I don't pronounce your names correctly. All right, in no particular order, we have Professor Kayhan BARZEGAR, who is a professor at the Islamic Azad University and senior academic advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran. Next up, we have Major General Adel Mohamed, Hassan ELDEIB. He's the director of the Strategic Studies Center at MENA High Military Academy in Egypt. Following him, we have Dr. Nicole Petty, whom I had breakfast with this morning. He's the director of Institute for Global Studies and former advisor at the Ministry of Defense in Italy. After him, we have Dr. Amina Khan, director of Center for Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Pakistan. Next up, we have Dr. Bassam Abu Abdullah, Professor of International Relations and Director at the Central School of the Ba'ath Party in Syria. I believe you'll be joining us online. And last but not least, Professor Zakir Hussein Azad, former professor at Azad University in Afghanistan and current professor at the University of Bucharest. So a very warm welcome to our panelists. And lastly, that's me. My name is Lily Ong. I'm from Singapore. I'm a PhD student at MDIMO, Moscow State Institute of International Relations in Russia, and I will be your moderator for this session. Now, this is a non-scripted session. I have no idea what each panelist intends to talk about. So I'll be making up questions as we go along. And I strongly encourage the audience to do the same. Do not waste this opportunity to ask these experts your burning questions. So let's go ahead and kick off with Dr. BARZEGAR. Yes. Yes, we may do so.
Morning. Thank you very much for my colleagues and I in the academic sector. This conference is very significant because it's the starting point for us to know more Romania. So I thank you, Dr. Vladius and Dr. Morishan, getting us here, as well as the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran for facilitating to come to this great country. I would like to start by new geopolitical developments in the region. I think 2 significant matters changed the entire regional geopolitics in a different way for the first time. First of all, it's the Ukrainian war. Everyone is talking about that nowadays. It's the topic that every issue of international relations is related with that, starting from energy security to food security, even internal affairs of European countries, Sudan, other places of the world, Iran, the Middle East, and West Asian countries, no doubt. But before that, I think another political development has affected the regional politics, and that is the US withdrawal, or perhaps better to say the US fiasco in withdrawing from Afghanistan and the policies that the US did in the region that has further complicated the regional politics. This is, I think, important, and perhaps it has affected the war in Ukraine beforehand, in a way. As a result, I think that perhaps we are talking about the challenges of the Ukrainian war. Previous speakers talked about this. But I would like to mention one opportunities for the regional countries. While we have the war with great powers, I think the opportunity came by that the southern regional states are breathing, and I think these developments have somehow affected and increased regional cooperation. And we see the result in Iran, Saudi Arabia, successful talk in the 5th round of talk. More good relations between Iran and UAE and other countries in the region. So I think that the result for the regional countries has been more, regional cooperation. In terms of the attention to energy security, if Europe is going to change its discourse of importing energy, counting more and dependency more on the regional countries, that's an opportunity, I guess. I think Iran is also favoring to that regard. I'm not saying that Iran will replace the Russian oil and energy. Iran will not do that because Iran thinks the strategic and geopolitically, the significance of Russia in its relations, no doubt. But still, I think it's an opportunity because we will see a chain of change in terms of the shift in energy security towards the Persian Gulf. And the Persian Gulf is becoming more significant for international energy security. That's something that we can talk about. So as a result of these two developments, I think regional countries are more inward-looking first. Second, they are diversifying their international relations. And third, again, I think we see an increased regional cooperation. This relates to other concepts. For instance, we see a shift from a global chain of goods to the regional supply of goods. We see neighborhood policies, especially on the Iran side, and it has been successful. For instance, after the Ukrainian war, we see the outlook and perspective of a new Asian union between Russia, China, India, Iran, and it could be extended to Turkey, even though Turkey is a member of NATO. But Turkey's place is very complicated. It is, as usual, trying to take advantage of the opportunity. Turkey is now the place for the Russian investments, tourism, other things, and at the same time, it's playing its role well, I guess, in the NATO context. So we see that the southern countries or emerging regional powers are very cautious, very careful to not take any sides in this war between the West and not the East, but another power in this global politics. So I would say that it's an opportunity for southern countries to move forward and try to increase the relations. We see less tensions nowadays in our region. My second point is about the Iranian nuclear deal. Professor Islami mentioned well, Ambassador of Iran mentioned well about this as well at some point. I'm sure we will talk more on that. But we have been, Iran has been very serious about concluding of this, deal. However, I think the Americans have their own domestic politics. the desire of the regional allies in the region, and at the same time, this traditional American way of not cutting any deal with countries that try to express themselves. I think the blame lands on the US. Iran wants sanctions lifted. Of course, Iran has economic hardships, no doubt. But at the same time, it's serious to talk, and it would like to express its right. And I believe that this will happen at the end, but it will be very harmful for many sides. And it will bring, more geopolitical, complexity for the regional politics if it is going to scale in this way. So this is, about the Iranian nuclear deal. My last point, moderator, is about, security collective policy in the Persian Gulf. I guess, better than I do that, there have been a lot of security measures introduced by different countries. We have, for instance, the Iranian model, which is that is almost peace endeavor. That for the first time, Iran offered comprehensive cooperation with the Persian Gulf countries, significantly introducing two principles, that is non-intervention and non-aggression. This is very important and modest, offer by Iran at a certain time, introduced by the previous administration and continued with this administration as well. We have the Russian model that, is focused on, bringing stability for the region and talking with everyone, which with the Ukrainian war has somehow shifted in a new discourse, perhaps. We have the European model, which is focusing on stability and refraining refugees from the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe. They would like to establish stability in their own way and their own politics, which is legitimized. And we have the Arab model that are counting on the US, security guarantees. All of them are around, but there is one common thing on all of these things, these models, and that is that as a constant, it is accepted that it must be a collective effort to establish security system in the Persian Gulf. But the Iranian perspective is that this model must be a regional model, not necessarily coming from outside. This doesn't mean that Iran does not recognize the interests of the extra-regional actors. Iran recognizes that they have, energy security concerns, they have commercial interactions with the Persian Gulf Arab countries, no doubt. But at the same time, experiences show that in the history, that no regional collective security system will be successful when outside power are strategically trying to establish coalitions with different countries. This is not good for the region, and I think that at the end of the day, we go towards a kind of security system that is founded on regional solution and regional characteristics. This is something that is quite obvious. I think I have said enough for now about the Ukrainian war. Iran has taken a neutral policy. Iran is a historical country. Of course, it has close relations with Russia, but it was a smart policy introduced by the supreme leader of Iran, and timing that Iran will stay neutral because it has good relations and bilateral relations with Ukraine. It was the victim of a war itself, so it condemns war by any means, no doubt. But we should understand that the Ukrainian war brought about a lot of geopolitical dynamics for the region. By that, I think I stop here. Thank you again for inviting me. this interesting topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. BARZEGAR. May I just check if there's any questions on the floor? If not, I'm going to ask my questions. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask my question. Now, Dr. BARZEGAR, clearly with the cessation of Russian oil to Europe, there is an opportunity for Middle East. My question is Middle East ready to step up to take on that opportunity?
By the Middle East, I'm representing Iranian perspective. I would say that, yeah, in the long term, this will happen because the discourse of the energy security might change in the European perspective. But in the short term, I do not think that this will be replaced by Arab countries. Iran has its own, energy policy. I said that, Iran will not for $100 million or $1 billion try to somehow change its relations with Russia to replace them. But naturally, the market will find its place in the long run, perhaps a couple of years.
Thank you, Dr. BARZEGAR. Just one more question for you. You mentioned the interference of the external powers. I wonder, is this not time for Middle Eastern countries to come together to have some kind of common understanding on the role of external powers? Shouldn't you reach some kind of guidelines on how to interact with external powers, or if this is even possible?
Well, in the long term, I think it is possible. Because you know that there is no benefit to the external powers involving too much in the regional affairs. We see in the last decade a great shift of regionalization of the conflicts in the region. Regional actors are becoming much more significant actors. For instance, Iran's role in Afghanistan, Iran's role in Syria. They have taken the fields. Foreign powers cannot handle the post-conflict situation, especially the US. When we talk of foreign powers, it's the US. When it goes to Russia, Russia is more, realistic actors to playing with the regional affairs. For instance, Russia has good relations, of course, before the Ukrainian war, good relations with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran. We'd like to talk with everyone, but this is not US style. The US is excluding Iran, a great nation state, powerful nation state, from the story of the region. That's not possible. So I guess, less US involvement in the region will be beneficial for the region.
Thank you, Dr. BARZEGAR. Now, next up, we'd like to invite Dr. Amina Khan to give a presentation. Dr. Khan? Oh, yeah, she'd like to. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Maybe you can take it out. Take it out.
No,
I'll hear your face.
Can you hear me now? All right. Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, and thank you to the organizers. It's been a struggle getting here, but it's been well worth it. And as discussed yesterday, I would appreciate more than 5 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, and I won't take it in the next round. Anyway, so as you're all aware, circumstances in Afghanistan have drastically changed, and they continue to do so since August 2021, particularly after the rather irresponsible US withdrawal. Now, many of you will say, why irresponsible? I'm using the term irresponsible because regional countries were not consulted when they should have been. When President Biden came into power and he said he was going to do a review of the process, one thought that regional countries would have been consulted. And if they had been, I think regional countries would have played a more greater role, or they would have taken more ownership with the current situation in Afghanistan. And you see that when regional countries do have an approach towards Afghanistan, it isn't so much consolidated. There is no regional platform, but I'll come back to that later. Now, Since the Taliban dispensation are in power, this has resulted in immense uncertainty, and a number of questions, rather unaddressed questions, have been brought up. For example, what does the Taliban's rule mean for governance? What does it mean for political freedom, for women's rights, counterterrorism assurances, and I think most importantly, regional peace and stability? Now, even within the confines of the current interim setup, the real test for the Taliban, began the day they came into power, and it is, again, by no means limited to just assuming power. I think it revolves more around legitimacy, acceptance, performance, and of course, recognition that they continue to struggle with. Now, everything isn't as unique as it seems. One has seen an overall improvement in security of the country. Governance, continues to remain a huge challenge, but remember, governance has been replaced by security. And that is one important aspect that I think does warrant some sort of recognition for the group. But at the same time, as I said, governance is an issue, and the Taliban are struggling when it comes to consolidating their power and their position within the country, even within the group itself, and formulate policies towards Afghan institutions. And I think here it's important to realize, and to be fair, I am not an advocate of the group, certainly, but I think we need to call a spade a spade. And I think we need to realize that Afghanistan has never had its own indigenous economy. It has inherited weak institutions. And as I said, an non-existent economy, not to mention the ongoing humanitarian crisis, and then they've got floods and drought and whatnot. Now, the provision of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan by certain countries, primarily regional countries, has certainly been reassuring, but it isn't enough to sustain the Afghan population, where 95% of them, are facing food insecurity. Now, another aspect that I think warrants recognition for the group is that despite the fact that there has been a brain drain, all the intelligent people of Afghanistan, the educated lot have left, the group has been able to collect $400 million in total revenue from customs. And I think this is something, again, that needs recognition. Now, while everybody understands the limitations of the Taliban regarding governance and resources, and the fact that there are internal divisions within the group, the fact of the matter is that now that the Taliban are in power, they have a responsibility to deliver. They need to ensure that they deliver on their pledges of reform. There is no other way about it. This is something that is not acceptable to regional countries and certainly not to the international community. There is no excuse. They have to deliver when it comes to basic yet fundamental human rights. And that, of course, pertains to women's rights and education for all. It was unfortunately very upsetting when we saw just before the OIC CFM meeting in Pakistan, where the Taliban reversed their decision, unfortunately, to not allow girls to return to high school. Now, what is the fear? We talk about lessons learned. Have we learned any lessons? I don't think so, because more or less the international community is repeating what they did in the past. The only difference is the dynamics have changed. There are more actors, more regional players, and non-state actors. So in my mind, the fear in Afghanistan is not of a civil war, because I don't feel that the NRF has the external support or the internal support for a civil strike. In my mind, it is more about transnational terrorist groups like the IS state to take over the situation. And we have seen, by the way, since the Taliban came into power, a spike in terrorist attacks against regional countries, and more so, for example, Pakistan, with the Taliban, Pakistan waging major attacks. So if the Taliban are not able to deliver on their basic pledges, it is going to be problematic for countries even like Pakistan to engage with the group, let alone move towards recognition. And I think it's important here maybe to go back to the Doha agreement. Many say it's problematic. It is problematic. The biggest issue was that Kabul was excluded, but we have to accept that the Taliban came through a process. We might not agree with that process, but it was a process in which the Americans did empower the Taliban through this agreement. And therefore, it is a collective responsibility, and both sides have to deliver on this. And I think it's very important to mention what the former UN Special Representative for Afghanistan, Ms. Nair, said, and I'd like to quote, "Afghanistan's collapsing economy is heightening the risk of extremism. This is a major concern for regional countries." Again, I would say Pakistan, and of course, where many, by the way, Afghans are being deported from Europe under the prejudice or under the title of economic migrants. Afghanistan is still not stable, and I think this is important to realize. I will quickly just end by saying that the Taliban did not come into power in isolation. They came through a process, and therefore the major stakeholder, which is the US, has a responsibility. Regional countries also have a responsibility. I believe that there is a strange strategic coincidence for the first time in the region, where all immediate neighbors of Afghanistan appear to be on the same page, where they do recognize that the Taliban is a dispensation, but they also recognize that the Taliban have to deliver. Now, while regional countries do have this consolidated approach, as I said, no regional country is willing to step in and bail the Americans out. Therefore, it is a responsibility of the Americans to fulfill the Doha Agreement and also ensure that the current dispensation governs and that there is some semblance of stability, because what is the second doctrine? Transnational terrorist groups? So these are questions that need to be kept in mind. And lastly, it is important, the onus is equally on the Taliban. They have no excuse, they have to deliver when it comes to basic and fundamental human rights. And I think regional countries will not move towards recognition unless and until the Taliban deliver on these basic policies. So I will end here and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. May I check if there's some questions from the floor, please? Don't be shy. Oh, yes, sir. Just.
Thank you for your brief and quite comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. You started with the words irresponsible U.S. withdrawal. You sort of argued little detail, but important detail, this evaluation. So my first question comes naturally. What is the degree of trust Pakistan has on the U.S. policy at this moment? Thank you.
Sorry, maybe you misunderstood. I said irresponsible.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Yes. Right. So irresponsible withdrawal. Well, you see, it is unfortunate, but I think, as I said, when President Biden came into power, since he has had experience, within the region, particularly since he served in the Biden administration, Pakistan expected the US to behave in a more responsible manner, and I think the entire set of events that took place, regional countries, including the Taliban, were not anticipating such a quick, takeover. This is something that's very important. Another major issue is that I felt that when Biden came into power, he shifted his approach more towards China, and he felt that, Afghanistan was a regional issue. And I think this is very disingenuous, because we don't want to see the return of the US certainly to the region. We want regional countries to take ownership, and regional countries are taking ownership. The policy now, to be very honest with the Americans, I feel that they are distant. They engage with the Taliban to a certain degree, but I don't think they're putting enough pressure on the Taliban to deliver. And I feel that the Americans do have that kind of influence over the group to at least deliver on basic pledges. Number two is the issue of the whole $9.5 billion dollars that the Afghan claim is theirs. I think this is another important issue that Pakistan would like at least the Americans to deliver on. If you're not willing to give that amount of money to the Afghan population, because of the sensitivities that revolve around it with its linkages to the 9/11 victims, other means of support needs to be provided to the population in Afghanistan. Because at the end of the day, it's Pakistan that faces the brunt, followed by Iran. Even though we have now started a very robust border management scheme, we are letting Afghans stay in night. If you come to Pakistan now, you will see more refugees than you've ever had, and we already have more than 3 billion. So this is a major issue for Pakistan, and we have been raising it with the Americans, and we hope that better sense will prevail within Washington too. You have a special rep that on and off meets the Taliban, but nothing substantial is moving forward. And in August, it will mark 1 year since the Taliban have been in power. So I feel that while, again, I will repeat and reiterate, Ukraine is a major issue, we understand, but so is Afghanistan. And therefore, it is important for, I think, Washington to revisit its policy and maybe return back to the Doha Agreement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Just a quick question from my sponsors. You're from Pakistan. I'm going to ask you this. I think one of the key reasons for U.S. to stay there in Afghanistan is their inability to get Pakistan to oppose the Taliban. But Pakistan has always been very consistent in their stance that they envisage a friendly Afghanistan next door. And in this picture of a friendly Afghanistan, the Taliban are in it. So my question to you is, why do you think the United States is so stuck in its unrealistic expectation that they can get Pakistan to oppose the Taliban?
Look, I'm going to be blunt here and say Pakistan is damned if we do it, damned if we don't. It is just as simple as that. And we've always been a very convenient scapegoat. To be honest with you, if it was up to the Pakistanis, maybe the Taliban would have been in power 20 years ago. No, please understand that the Taliban came into power through a process. And that was the Doha Agreement. And Pakistan did have certain reservations, as did other regional countries. And the fact that regional countries were not consulted when this agreement was signed, to be very honest with you, because time and again, regional countries, including Pakistan, would say Kabul or the dispensation headed by President Ghani needs to be a part of the process. So this is, I think, something very important to keep in mind. And I think we need to move beyond the past of scapegoating and blaming one another. Afghanistan is a shared and a collective responsibility. And to be very honest with you, which country has more to gain and more to lose? It's Pakistan, because we currently have more than 4 million Afghan refugees. The Americans don't. So I think instead of scapegoating, let's try and have a consolidated approach towards the country. And whether we like it or not, the Taliban are in power. They are the current dispensation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. Well, next up, we'd like to invite Major General Adel Mohamed Hassan, ELDEIB, Director of the Strategic Studies Center at Minster High, to give his presentation.
السلام عليكم. معقول بالنسبة للكوان البلادي كان معايا في المعهد الاقتصادي للشرق الأوسط في الجلسة الأولى. في البداية أود أن أعبر عن امتناني وشكري العميق على الدعوة الكريمة للمشاركة في هذا المنتدى الكبير، وسعادتي بالتواجد مع كوكبة من الخبراء وأصحاب الرأي والفكر الاستراتيجي حول العالم، متمنيا أن يسهم هذا التجمع في طرح رؤى وأفكار تعود بالنفع على دولنا وتحقق الهدف المنشود في عالم أكثر أمانا واستقرارا. واسمحوا لي أن أستعرض في الوقت المخصص تقييم مختصر بشأن تطورات الأوضاع في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. السادة الحضور، على مدار عقود ممتدة تعاني دول الشرق الأوسط من حالة التنافس والاستقطاب بين القوى الدولية ومحاولة مد السيطرة وزيادة الهيمنة على مناطق النفوذ والصراعات في إطار تعزيز مصالحها الاستراتيجية. وعلى الصعيد الإقليمي لا شك أن منطقة الشرق الأوسط تمر منذ اندلاع ما يعرف به ثورات الربيع العربي عام 2011 بمرحلة شديدة الخطورة والتعقيد. تشهد فيها معظم دول المنطقة حالة من عدم استقرار الأوضاع، والتي تتفاوت أنماطها ودرجاتها حسب تفاعل كل دولة في محيطها الإقليمي والدولي. وإذا نظرنا إلى الوضع الحالي في منطقة الشرق الأوسط سوف نجد أن هناك بعض العوامل والاعتبارات التي يمكن أن ترسم صورة واقعية لهذا الوضع الصعب، وقد حاولت في هذا المجال رصد 8 عوامل منها كالآتي. العامل الأول: القوى الخارجية المنخرطة في أزمات المنطقة والتي تتحرك في إطار واحد فقط، هو كيفية الحفاظ على مصالحها غير عابئة لمصالح شعوب المنطقة. ثانياً، لا يزال الوضع العربي يعاني من كافة المشكلات التي شهدها منذ فترة طويلة، دون أن تكون هناك أي حلول أو أي إمكانيات لوضع حلول لحل نهائي مقبول لأي من هذه الأزمات. ثالثاً، استثمار إسرائيل للأوضاع العربية الحالية من أجل التوجه نحو مزيد من التطبيع مع الدول العربية دون تقديم أي تنازلات في القضية الفلسطينية. رابعاً، سعي تركيا إلى تثبيت نفوذها في المناطق الموجودة بها بشمال العراق وسوريا في محاولة كسب مناطق نفوذ جديدة في الدول التي تدعي أنها تمثل مجالاً حيوياً لها. خامساً، استمرار قضية السد الأثيوبي دون وجود حلول نهائية تتوائم مع مطالب موقف دولتي المصب مصر والسودان، والمتمثلة في ضرورة التوصل إلى اتفاق شامل وقانوني وملزم بشأن عملية ملء وتشغيل السد. سادساً، الأزمة الروسية الأوكرانية التي أدت إلى المزيد من المخاطر والتهديدات في المنطقة وخاصة على المجال الاقتصادي والأمني. وسابعاً، إمكانية عودة العناصر الإرهابية إلى المنطقة خلال المرحلة القادمة. أخيراً، عدم التوصل لاتفاق نووي جديد بين كل من إيران والولايات المتحدة والاتحاد الأوروبي أمر من شأنه استمرار توتر الأوضاع الأمنية في المنطقة. وباستعراض وتقييم أبرز التطورات الإقليمية يمكن الإشارة إلى الآتي على الصعيد السياسي: انخراط بعض القوى الدولية في إعادة تشكيل النظم الإقليمية بمناطق المصالح عبر الاتفاقات والتحالفات وموضوعات ضبط التسلح، مع فرض رقابة مشددة للتحكم والسيطرة على التكنولوجيا الحديثة والنووية والحد من فرص انتقالها للقوى المنوئة، تحقيقاً لأهداف الاحتكار والتنافس والتغيير في موازين القوى في النظم الإقليمية. مع استمرار غياب الحلول العادية للقضايا المصيرية في المنطقة كما أشرت، خاصة القضية الفلسطينية التي ما زالت قضية مركزية لدى أغلب شعوب المنطقة من ناحية، وعدم التعامل الدولي بشفافية مع القدرات النووية الإسرائيلية من ناحية أخرى. أما على الصعيد الاقتصادي، نجد أن تعدد الأزمات المالية والاقتصادية في معظم دول المنطقة نتيجة تداعيات جائحة كوفيد-19 والحرب الروسية الأوكرانية، فضلاً عن اتجاه النظام الاقتصادي العالمي إلى زيادة الاندماج داخل النظام الرأسمالي والتكتلات الاقتصادية بأشكالها المتعددة وتحرير التجارة العالمية ودخول منظمة التجارة العالمية حيز التنفيذ، مع ازدياد هامشية العالم الثالث نتيجة تلك المتغيرات في ظل صعوبة ملاحقة للثورة الصناعية الثالثة وتحرير الإنتاج الصناعي، مع توفير احتمالات تصاعد الصراع حول نار الموارد الطبيعية في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، خاصة الطاقة بشرق المنطقة الإقليمية. المشروع الإسرائيلي الذي نجح في تطوير قدراته التقليدية وغير التقليدية في ظل دعم دولي غربي خاصة من جانب الولايات المتحدة لضمان تفوقها الكمي والنوعي. والمشروع التركي الذي نجح في تأسيس تواجد فاعل في محيطها الحيوي. أما المشروع العربي الجاري تشكيله بين الدول العربية مصر والأردن والسعودية والإمارات والبحرين، إلى جانب مشروع تيار الإسلام السياسي الذي ما زال القائمين عليه يسعون إلى إعادة إنتاجه في عديد من الدول. هذه المشاريع لم يتبقى أمام القائمين عليها المزيد من رفاهية الوقت في ظل ما يشهده العالم من متغيرات وأزمات حادة ومتلاحقة، بل يجب عليهم الانخراط في حوارات جادة وشفافة للوصول إلى منظومة إقليمية للأمن الجماعي لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط. تلك المنظومة المنشودة يجب أن تراعي التوازنات ومصالح مختلف الأطراف وتحترم مبادئ السيادة الوطنية وخصوصية التقاليد والأديان والأعراف الشعوبية. حتى تتجنب دول المنطقة سيناريوهات الحروب الإقليمية التي لن ينتصر فيها أي طرف. واسمحوا لي بتقديري أنه رغم هذه التوترات التي تشهدها المنطقة والتي تنبئ في بعض الأوقات بإمكانية انفجار الوضع بين بعض الأطراف المتصارعة، إن الواقع يشير إلى أن مسألة تفجر الأوضاع في المنطقة تعد مستبعدة إلى حد كبير في الوضع الحالي، ولا سيما أن كافة القوى المتصارعة أصبحت تحقق أهدافها دون اللجوء لخيار الحرب. ولي هنا سؤال: كيف يمكن لدول منطقة الشرق الأوسط والمجتمع الدولي أن يحقق السيطرة على هذه التوترات المتكررة ومنع تفاقمها في المستقبل؟ ولعل من دواعي سروري أن يناقش هذا المنتدى الكريم خلال هذه الجلسة بعض الموضوعات ذات الصلة مثل جهود الوساطة الإيرانية السعودية ومبادئ نظام الأمن الجماعي. وفي الختام أشكركم على حسن الاستماع وأتمنى للمنتدى والمشاركين كل التوفيق.
Thank you very much, General. May I check if there's any questions from the floor, please, for the General? All right, if there's no question, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, Dr. Nicole Petty.
Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, thank you to the organizer for having invited me here. I'm really glad to be here again. So it's very received. Well, I would like to use my minutes in order to bring perspective from the Italian point of view on the region, and in particular on the Maghreb region. And well, I would like to start using the case of Libya in order to express what I think Italy is concerned in this phase. Well, as we have seen in the recent past, there have been riots both in the east and the west of Libya. The parliament is fire in Tobruk, there have been protests in Tripoli. This is showing how the dissatisfaction of the Libyan society is widely diffused in both regions. It's the product of a series of mistakes which have been done by the entire political system in the country, and which is feeding a growing unsatisfaction on the social level in the entire country. Well, basically, the Libyan crisis have been depicted in using several different interpretational models in the recent past, revolutionary against counter-revolutionary forces, Islamist versus secular forces, democratic versus terrorist forces on the ground. And my opinion is that despite all these narratives, different narratives embed some elements of reality, the real evolution of the crisis is driven by the fact that opening the Pandora's box of the collapse of the institutions in 2011 basically enabled a group of local militias and several different local groups to acquire power that they're not willing to lose and they're not willing to compromise in these things, where we have basically two competing governments, one in Tripoli which is not willing to accept the nomination of the new caretaker, Fatih Bashaghi, which was incidentally a former Ministry of Interior in Tripoli. And basically, the BARZEGAR government has failed to deliver on the elections last December. And the Bashaghi government is not in a position to exert its power and enter in Tripoli with the intent of restarting the electoral process where the previous government has failed. Well, these are the local dimensions, basically, driven by a vast group of domestic interests, mostly linked to militias, but there is also an international network of interest, which is heavily contributing in shaping the Libyan crisis. And basically, there are two major camps, those supporting the government in Tripoli and those supporting the HMR in Tobruk, the eastern part of the country. And this is reflecting how controversial and intense is the debate also at the international level over the Libyan crisis. And well, I'm a country which was certainly neutral in this crisis, despite the attempt of being perceived as willing to maintain friendly relations with both parts. And on the ground, we have always supported the Tripoli government, clearly more than the Eastern government, and we have firstly opposed General Haftar in the political process. But at a wider level, there are many other relevant actors which are playing a huge role in Libya, with, of course, consequences on the ground. Turkey, which is becoming probably one of the most important actors on the ground in supporting the government in Tripoli. Have been on the other side, Egypt, the Emiratis, and Russia to a certain extent, even if among them probably there is not a precise linear strategy in supporting each of the actors in the East. Then Qatar, of course, again on the other side, in supporting the government of Tripoli. And this has contributed enormously in destabilizing Libya, and destabilizing the capacity of the local government and the local authorities to find a solution in the conundrum of the domestic political system. Within this already complex framework, there are several other issues which are considered as extremely relevant from an Italian point of view in this space. Well, the risk of a new authoritarian environment in Tunisia with the new constitution, which has been presented by President Sayed and which will be submitted to a referendum on July 25th. The renewed tensions between Algeria and Morocco, and the issue of Western Sahara, the huge rearmament problem connected with the desire of Algeria of investing a huge amount of money in the renewal of most of its military equipment. And apart from that, there are other issues connected with energy security and food scarcity, which could affect the stability of the region and have a direct impact on European security and regional security more in general. If we add to this the growing critical decline of the entire area, where Europeans and the international community seem to be unable to provide any concrete solution, we could see how this evolution could be critical and how it could be detrimental for European and regional interests in the short run. My second very quick consideration is related to the new NATO Council which emerged after Madrid, which from an Italian point of view, it's seen as potentially dangerous in the consideration of the risk coming from the south. It's basically clear that whatever will happen in the Mediterranean, in Sahel, in North Africa, will be not considered by NATO as dominant or more relevant elements of interest. So this means that it will be more and more the burden of the Europeans. And we have to admit that the Europeans have not a clear capacity or well-defined capacity of dealing with politics and security in the region. And the risk is then of assisting to an increase of the tensions in the region, the lack of capacity in managing these crises. And if we consider how intense it will be the transformation of the energy market system in the next 10, 15 years, and the lack of diversification capacity in the region, we can think about the kind of risk we are assuming in managing the economic decline of the region without a strategy of cooperation, or without, as we have seen today, credible capacity of cooperation from the European side. So the evolution of this crisis in the region is bringing a threat which is evolving in a way which is basically affecting the capacity of the Europeans. It's, in my opinion, not visible a long-term strategy from both the European side and the NATO side on how to deal with this emerging threat. And the risk of a rapid increase in this critical evolution and the risk of let's say, dealing with factors like energy security or migration or security linked to terrorism could be much more rapid and much more violent than we expect in the future. And in this case, it seems that there is a lack of capacity in the defining strategy, which could be extremely dangerous and detrimental for European interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Petty. May I check if there's any questions from the floor, please? All right, I'll ask my question then. Now, Dr. Petty, for all the cadets, Libya has been an important test for Italy, the foreign policy of Italy. I know there are many good lessons, but if you could just list one key lesson, what is the most important lesson we can learn from the foreign policy of Italy towards Libya? Keeping in mind, of course, we can learn from features of success as well as failure.
Well, it's difficult to find most important lessons. We have managed a very difficult situation from the beginning. The feeling from an Italian point of view is that we have suffered a crisis which has been imposed in 2011 through a strategy which, through a narrative which was not exactly reflecting the evolution of the local Libyan crisis. There have been a capacity, for example, from Qatar at the beginning to managing the narrative against Gaddafi and the regime. I'm not saying that it has to be defended, of course, but there has been an evolution which was mostly driven by Qatar in the first phase. And then we have suffered the competition between Qatar and the Emirates, and there were several other actors entering into the field in the later phase. So what Italy has tried to manage is complexity which was beyond the capacity of a single country. Certainly beyond the capacity of a relevant actor on the ground like Italy. We had a lot of interest there, political, economic matters, the complexity of this crisis and beyond the capacity. And the biggest problem that we have faced, I think, was mostly related to
the divisions inside the European Union and crafting a common strategy and crafting a common solution in order to solve the Libyan crisis. We were part. I'm not defending Italy, saying that we were the right. We were part of the problem. We were not independent, but it was a combination of factors which has really crushed our capacity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Petty. I think if we can all adopt his spirit of humility, we'll all be one step closer to peace. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Azad from the University of Bucharest to give his presentation.
In the name of Allah, ladies and gentlemen, all participants, ambassadors from different countries, professors, and officials who participated in this conference, let me put forward my gratitude to you, especially for those individuals and organizations that organized this conference. Thank you all, and thank you for invitation. To be honest, I'm highly happy to hear today and find such an opportunity to share my idea with you. And I apologize, first and foremost, I apologize for this slideshow because I strongly believe that these pictures is a present situation of Afghanistan and as official record of Taliban. Theoretical lesson of the failure of democratization in Afghanistan. The defeat of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan on August 15, 2021 was an unexpected and shocking tragedy in the history of Afghanistan. With the failure of the system in August, all political, military, and security, cultural, economic, and social infrastructure collapsed. The hope of living and staying in Afghanistan was completely lost. The result of 20 years of collective efforts of Afghan and the international community were destroyed overnight. The ground for being and staying in Afghanistan were destroyed. All classes of society fled from Afghanistan as much as they could. And the tragedy of history, for example, the falling of the young people who had taken refuge on the wing of the plane out of fear of the Taliban and fell from space to the ground from the American plane happened in this date. All the mentioned cases are the objective result of the collapse of the political system in Afghanistan. But what's important for us is to concentrate on the lesson and the theoretical consequence of the collapse of the Republican system in Afghanistan in August 2021. Before dealing the theoretical consequence of the collapse of the system in Afghanistan, I would like to share some points as an introduction. First, the experience of the political system in Afghanistan is like that of many countries in the region. The conflict between culture and politics in Afghanistan is an example of general conflict between culture and politics in many countries in the region, including some countries in the Middle East. Second, The symmetric similarity can be clearly seen between Afghanistan and many countries in the region. Normative resistance to democratization is not only the unique situation of Afghanistan, but it's a widespread narrative of many Islamic countries in the region. But listen and theoretical consequence of the collapse of the political system in Afghanistan. One, democracy is a seedling that should be grown, not planted. What John Stuart Mill said that democracy is an internal affair that should be based on the cultural context of one's own society, not brought on by other countries as industry like the experience of Afghanistan. Second, based on the background of democracy in Afghanistan, democracy as a value package has only a seasonal function for actors. Members of NATO, maybe it's a negative idea, but I think it's a real. The member of NATO never looked to democracy as intrinsic value in Afghanistan. Third, the failure of democracy in Afghanistan means the beginning of the failure of the liberal democratic value system throughout the world. The failure of democracy means the end of the liberal ideology of democracy. Democracy has lost its appeal and is no longer able to mobilize people as an ideology like in the past. Fourth, the victory of the realism over idealism. Despite 20 years of efforts in Afghanistan to achieve the human rights aspiration and institutionalize the value package of democracy in Afghanistan, it turned out that this view was absurd and unrealistic. What is real is the real. What is real is the fact which currently exists in Afghanistan, like expanding of extremism, despair, disbelief in democracy, poverty, terror, deprivation of all basic rights, killing, and poverty. 5. Instrumental confrontation with terrorism. The world and the great powers have been very successful in creating new puzzles around the world, especially in Afghanistan, because they spend trillions of dollars to fight against Taliban in Afghanistan. After 9/11, 2001, they came to Afghanistan to suppress the Taliban as a terrorist group and introduce democracy as an intrinsic value for the new generation of Afghanistan. They expressed democracy as an unbearable version for the needs of Afghanistan and the region. But at the end of the day, Zolmay Khalilzad's speech as the representative of the United States of America in the peace talks in Qatar, that the kind of political system of Afghanistan, whether it's democratic or emirati, is related to Afghanistan itself, not related to the United States and the world. I believe that such a statement was the most responsible position taken by the American representative, and the failure of the Republican system began from that day. If the issue of Afghanistan were related to Afghanistan, and the opinion of the Taliban was important and significant, what were the reason of killing and being killed for 20 years, for 2 decades? What does it mean? What does the American campaign to fight the Taliban means in the 2 last decades? I strongly believe that it doesn't make a sense. The last one, democracy is a cultural element rather than a political one. This means that the culture of a country must be in line with democracy to take root. Otherwise, with the tribal and monopolistic culture, it is not possible to establish and consolidate democracy. Democracy is a kind of soft power for people. It means that democratic value should be internalized in the society and act as persuasive power, not as a political project imposed on people like the experience and history of Afghanistan. Therefore, until democracy is not dealt with honestly, it is impossible to establish and consolidate democracy. Instrumental approach to democracy in Afghanistan may have threatened Afghanistan's survival, and Afghans are at risk of destruction. But sooner or later, the Taliban's strength in Afghanistan will also mean a threat to the international order. Therefore, we should be careful and cautious. And the Taliban government should never be recognized. Recognizing the Taliban government in Afghanistan means recognizing the threat to the order of the international system around the world. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azad, for the very passionate and moving speech. Let me just quickly share this. I lived in the US for many years. I love the United States. It's one of the world's most beautiful democracy. But I will say this just because a certain model of governance work for one country doesn't mean that it's going to work for another country. I observe that Americans tend to think that their values are universal, but their values are not universal. Our values are shaped by the history and our personal cultural experience. If I can just share one quote from Lee Kuan Yew, because it came to my mind as I was listening to Dr. Azad. He said this. He said, if Western values are in fact superior insofar as they bring about.
Unfortunately, I couldn't be in Bucharest to discuss with all of you. In my short intervention, I want very fast because I know the last speaker very heavy because everyone looking for taking break. Anyway, I will try very fast to talk. First of all, we should know recognizing that we are in transitional period from one international world order to another one, from unipolar to multipolar. What kind of multipolar, I don't know until now, but the world is changing a lot, especially after the Ukrainian crisis. And it needs from us to put many questions in front of all researchers. The second question, or the second point, that the lessons taken from Afghanistan, I think my colleague from Afghanistan mentioned some of the points which I want to talk about. But anyway, I will repeat some of these points. First of all, America and NATO is not protecting anyone, not in the MENA, not in Afghanistan. They are looking for their interests. The second one, that there is no state in the world, including US and the West, can enforce a political model of system on the other countries. This model is collapsed already. The experiences from Afghanistan and Iraq is giving us the results. The next point, that there is different cultures in the world, different traditions, different histories for every people should be respected. Nobody can enforce its cultures and values on the others. The other point, that the whole world is depending on each other. Nobody can ignore it. Democracy is not one model. And we cannot talk about democracy when we are in front of poor people when we lack electricity, the oil, water, education, etc. This is a fantasy when we are talking about that. The other important point, I think that under economic sanctions, example, Syria, Afghanistan, or other Venezuela or other states, you cannot find solution. There is no solution through economic sanctions, which I can call it, it's some kind of a criminal sanctions against people. So in front of these lessons, we should take into consideration these lessons for the Middle East. Middle East or MENA is a part of the international world order. I think the Middle East, we could see different wars, including in Syria, Yemen, Libya, whatever you want. But these wars, unfortunately, not for the prosperity of the peoples in these countries. The other point that after 10 years of these wars, now in Syria we are entering the 12th years of this war. The Middle East now in front of two camps. The first camp, they are trying to call it a Arab NATO, which I can see that it's in the benefit of Israel, not in the benefit of the Arab states or other states in the region. And Israel, it's a problem, not a solution for the security in the Middle East. Why it's a problem? Because Israel should be solved the Palestinian question, and the international community should be the Palestinian question. When we are ignoring the Palestinian question, it means we are trying to say that there is no problem in Palestine. The other important thing that the region is looking for development, for stability. But how we can achieve that? I think not through the war. After 11 years of the war in Yemen, Syria, Libya, there is no way. Through dialogue. But how we can build this dialogue? This dialogue we should build on the respecting the internal affairs of every state. This is first. Secondly, democracy could not be enforced from others. The third, security should be balanced between all the states. Example, Turkey cannot talk about its security needs while it's occupying more than 8,000 kilometers from the sea. This problem could be solved. We cannot ignore that we need reforms in our countries, our societies, Muslim or Arab states. Absolutely, we need, but to make these reforms, we need time, we need dialogue more, we need development and stable societies. Otherwise, I think it's a line when we are speaking about democracy or changes. The most important thing with this is the last point, which I want to mention, that we should redefine some terminologies. The terminology of freedom. What do we mean in freedoms? The terminology of democracy, human rights, all these terminology we should redefine and to put a question about if it's a political instrument or if it's needs for every society. Anyway, I think that the MENA, it needs more dialogue, and I think that dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran is of Iran between Syria and Turkey is important. So to open a dialogue channels between the states in the region is very important. We need all to change a lot of our perceptions about of our understanding. But anyway, looking for the future through wars is finished. The superpower or other big states, it's unbeneficial for the region. example, Afghanistan or others. So we need to create a new atmosphere for dialogue and for looking of our interests. Talked about the challenges and opportunities, but our challenges now is in water, I think food crisis, energy crisis. This is important challenges for everyone, and without cooperation between MENA states and other states in the world, we cannot achieve anything. The last point that Syria is looking for peace, stability. Nobody can enforce on Syrian people its constitution or its model of development. But I think the other states should be stopped in interfering in the internal affairs of the regional state. Maybe this is the first step to understand each other more and through dialogue. Thank you very much for listening to me.